How is everyone tonight? Good. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Of all the lectures that I have been doing this spring as part of the 250 series, this one I've been really looking forward to because actually I was born and raised in North Andover. I grew up on Herrick Road over by Thompson School, stayed up here until I got married in 1997, and then moved to up towards Amesbury and Merrimack, Mass. So I was very excited when the North Andover Historical Society and Bob Allegretto asked me to be involved in Andover and North Andover's planning for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. What I want to start off with is, my love for the American Revolution came actually from my time here in North Andover. When I was in third grade, I believe my teacher was Mrs. Gessing. She brought us down on a field trip to the Bunker Hill Pavilion. And that was what initially sparked my interest in the American Revolution and following it. And at the time, one of the disappointing things was like, oh, Lexington conquered, this is great. What about North Andover? What did North Andover do? And of course, everyone just went, we don't know. We might have done something at Bunker Hill, we're not really sure. Well, fast forward to probably about 2000, 2001, I started really taking a deep dive into the role of the Andovers with an emphasis on the North Parish to see what they did. In North Andover and all the Merrimack Valley have an amazing story to tell. It's a story that doesn't get out. It's finally starting to get out. It's something that needs to be shared, and it's something that we should be very proud of as residents of the Merrimack Valley, that the story goes well beyond Lexington and Concord. So what we are going to be, there we go, okay. When historians look at 1774, 1775, the focus tends to be on Boston, or it tends to be on Lexington and Concord. Really, the Merrimack Valley doesn't get the attention that it deserves, and it's often ignored. This region played a key role in the wartime buildup against the Crown, and did not serve as a backdrop or footnote. And finally, from the rise of the Merrimack Valley Minutemen to the contributions of George Marsden, which we will talk about during this talk, the people of the Merrimack Valley played a very vital role in the coming war against England. So what we are going to discuss today, first of all, we will be covering the state of affairs. I'm going to give a thumbnail sketch of what is going on in Massachusetts in 1774. I will then talk about Massachusetts Provincial Congress's call for a wartime buildup and how the Merrimack Valley responded to that wartime buildup. I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch upon what is known as the Salem Affair. This was an incident that took place in February of 1775 down in Salem, Massachusetts. The Merrimack Valley did respond to this, and we will touch upon that briefly. I will also be talking about particularly Essex County with an emphasis on the Merrimack Valley, their role at Lexington and Concord. And then as a footnote and sort of a build-up to some talks I'm doing later this season, I do want to talk about the Merrimack Valley at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then if you're all good and behave yourselves, maybe I'll let you ask some questions. So we'll see. Now, for those who have attended my lectures before, you know I always give an inspirational quote. It's to get people motivated, get people excited about this particular event. And I thought long and hard, and I said, I have to go back to my North Andover roots. Okay, so when I decided I was going to say something, I basically just want to start off, first of all, North Andover is way cooler than Andover in every way possible, okay? However, I do have to say that all the cool kids went to Central Catholic, okay? But with all due respect to my neighbors, the Monroes, we're not going to talk about St. John's, okay? So let's get into. I want to start off with basically an overview, just a quick snapshot. Where are we in October of 1774 here in the Merrimack Valley? Well, we're in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. Various communities throughout Essex County and the Merrimack Valley decided to burn tea, destroy tea. There is this protest which ultimately gets the attention of England. And as a result of that attention, England passes what is known in the 19th century as the Intolerable Acts. Now, the Intolerable Acts had a whole series of measures, and there were various laws that were passed. And what they did, the intolerable acts, was first of all, they shut down the port of Boston. That impacted Boston economically. It horrified the residents around Boston because now the Crown is sort of moving towards excessive punishment. They also passed various laws. Ultimately, what happened was in the revocation of the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. Now, what is that particular charter? The Massachusetts Charter of 1691 is considered the Constitution of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It contains the Bill of Rights for colonists during this time. So for the Crown to actually suspend it and revoke it, this is the modern day equivalent, and again, I am apolitical, but this is the modern day equivalent of somebody going in and ripping up the Constitution, okay? So this is highly offensive to Massachusetts residents. On top of that, General Gage, who became the, General Thomas Gage, who became the royal governor of the colony, as well as the overall supreme commander of all British forces in North America, was given authority to shut down the Massachusetts legislature and dissolve it. And what happened was he did that. So by September of 1775, we have no government, we have no constitution, town meetings are in theory supposed to be suspended, and Boston is closed. The colony's capital has been moved to Salem, and the custom operations have been moved to Plymouth, Massachusetts, as well as Newburyport, Massachusetts. And so this horrified Massachusetts colonists because at this point, there's a common theme that I'm seeing popping up in September of 1775. Massachusetts colonists are convinced that they are going to end up similar to what happened in Ireland and similar to what happened in India, that the Crown is going to force Massachusetts Bay Colony into a war. England will come in and crush them and then enslave them. So when you start seeing various documents from 1774 through 1776, when you see these references of people writing, we are facing the shackles of slavery or we are about to be enslaved, this is their mindset at that particular time. So Massachusetts residents decide there is a call. Listen, counties, you need to get together and have county conventions since the legislature has now been wiped away. Our Constitution has been destroyed. How are we going to govern ourselves? Because basically, in almost a Star Wars type theme, we've got to form a rebel government. So what happens is Essex County in September of 1775 decides to have a county convention that is held in Ipswich. Andover sent delegates to that convention. Two principal things came out of that issue, and that was, first of all, the Massachusetts various conventions ruled that we need to raise an army, a Massachusetts Grand Army to defend our English liberties, our civil rights. Secondly, we need to form a rebel government known as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And that was actually formed in October of 1775. And right away, one of the very first things they do is they start moving towards war. For the first month, you were actually seeing the Massachusetts Provincial Congress predominantly focusing on a wartime buildup in the colony. So with that, let's talk about how Essex County, with an emphasis on the Merrimack Valley, prepares for war. Well, when you're dealing on October 26th of 1774, this is probably the most crucial day when it comes to Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Because what they do on that day, first of all, they say, listen, every town in the colony needs to prepare for war. Every town within the colony needs to start stockpiling ammunition and start collecting your weapons. They also basically say, we need to form a Minuteman company. So this particular order deals with pretty much they're saying it is time for us to mobilize for war. We have passed the point of no return. England is trying to enslave us. We can no longer negotiate with the Crown. We need to start preparing for war because it is coming. So what happens is during this prelude for war, the first thing you see is the Massachusetts Provincial Congress says, well, where are we going to get soldiers to fight our cause? And what they do is they look at the the militia arm. Massachusetts had a long history of a militia system. These weren't soldiers who just popped up out of the blue. Massachusetts militia system dates back to about 1640. And of course, at that time, they based their militia system on what was going on in England. The Massachusetts militia system was created predominantly for two reasons. One was in case there was some form of an emergency, a riot in town, not that North Andover ever had any riots. If there was a fire or there was some sort of emergency that required a law enforcement response. But more importantly, they existed for the purpose in case there were French raids. And throughout the 17th century, up until about the 1720s, the French were still raiding the Merrimack Valley. So that was the initial purpose of the militia. For militia was consisted of men who were between the ages of 16 and 60. Now, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress said, okay, we are going to take this militia system and we are going to draw men from that to serve as our Massachusetts Grand Army. If we go to war with England, we're going to use the militia system. But the first thing they realized was, we got to get rid of the loyalist officers who are commanding our militia units. So what they did was the Massachusetts Provincial Congress passed a resolution saying, hold officer elections. Hold an election and vote out those who are not loyal to the American cause. And that's what they did throughout October and into early November of 1774. An interesting story came from out of Haverhill. Colonel Richard Saltonstall. Saltonstall is a big name here in the Andovers, here in Haverhill as well. He was the colonel of the 4th Essex Regiment of Foot. The 4th Essex Regiment was the militia district for the Merrimack Valley. So if a town was located, one in Essex County, and two was part of the Essex County portion of, part of the part of the Merrimack Valley portion of Essex County, they would have been in the 4th Essex, okay? So Richard Saltonstall was the overall militia colonel of the 4th Essex. He was fiercely loyal to the crown. He had received much patriotism, much patronage as a result of his loyalty to the crown. And he refused to step down when he was notified we're holding officer elections. So as a result, a mob appeared in front of his home in Haverhill, and they encouraged him to perhaps resign his position. He refused. He said, I am loyal to the crown. You're a bunch of unruly mob. I'm not resigning. Well, what did they do? The mob at that point reached out to their local militia commanders in Haverhill, Bradford, and Salem, New Hampshire, and they marched on the guy's house. And they appeared a second time about a week later and said, hey, remember when we were talking with you last week about resignation? What do you think about it now? He quickly resigned and ended up moving to Boston quite rapidly. So the other thing that they did said, okay, Massachusetts Provincial Congress says, all right, now you got rid of your loyalist officers, there's a second step you need to do. The second step is we want you to draw recruits from each of your militia companies, approximately 50 men, and these individuals will be ready at a moment's notice to mobilize. The actual order basically says that the officers so elected from each militia company shall endeavor to enlist 1/4 of their respective companies and equipped and hold themselves in readiness on the shortest notice from the said Committee of Safety to march to a place of rendezvous. This is the order that created the Minutemen. Now, many people think Minutemen just sprung up out of nowhere, okay? Like the militia system in Massachusetts, Minutemen had been around since about King Philip's War, moving forward. These were rapid response units, okay, that were, in case of times of a military threat that's knocking on their doorstep, these minute companies were supposed to respond. During King Philip's War, it was usually they had to mobilize within an hour. By the time of Queen Anne's War, they're talking about a half hour. They even had minute companies on standby during the French and Indian War, although there were no real threats in this area in the 1750s, and that's when you get the term at a moment's notice. Now, the study that I've done, that I've looked at the various minute companies, including the Andovers, Haverhill, and Amesbury, generally speaking, your average Minuteman who is going to be recruited into this 1774, 1775 military unit, their age is generally between 16 and 25. Young men and young boys, and I apologize that my phone is ringing. How rude. I'm going to put mine. I violated the Historical Society's own rule. And as a side note, it was my daughter calling, so she can wait. She keeps threatening to, put me in a home, so I'm going to put her aside. Your Minutemen were generally between 16 and 25. They're your boys, okay? When you think of military service throughout the ages in the United States, you think of soldiers from World War II, World War I, Civil War. Most of them are 16 to 25. There's a reason behind that, and I say this often at my talks, if you've heard my talks before. If there is an emergency, my son is going to be 25 in May, so he's 24 right now, and then there's me. And we live up in Merrimack, Massachusetts, which at the time was part of Amesbury. If there was an emergency, the British are marching on Concord, and we had to mobilize to the town green, which is 1 mile from my house, who's going to get there first? My son, who's 24, runs about 5 miles a day, or me, who wants to stop off at Dunkin' Donuts first, get some tasty snacks, and then maybe I'll show up after I talk to some of my neighbors. You're going to go with the younger group. So what happens is, you're going to see shortly, there is this movement to start recruit Minutemen. Now, let's just take a break, because I'm talking about Minutemens, I'm talking about militias. Let me break it down a little further and also tell you what I'm seeing in Merrimack Valley at this time. Just described Minutemen. Minutemen are going to be your rapid response unit, the first out the door if there's an emergency. The British mobilize, your minute companies are going to mobilize first. From there, behind them are going to be your militia companies. These are, by law, the men, it's your standard military force of each town. Every town had at least one militia company in their community, Merrimack Valley included. Realistically, once you started taking a town and dividing it into different districts, like say the North Parish and the South Parish of Andover, you would have then at least 2 militia companies. On the eve of Lexington and Concord, Andover had 4 militia companies. 2 in what is present-day North Andover, 2 is in present-day Andover. There might have been a 5th one in what has been considered West Andover. I'm having difficulty trying to corroborate that they existed, but there were at least 4 militia units. Now, behind the militia units is one more group, the alarm list. Okay? The alarm list is your last reserve group. The alarm list is generally made up of people who are 55 and older. Okay? Usually, at first, on the eve of Lexington and Concord, it was 60 and older. But I started seeing towns actually reducing the age down to 55 and then down to 50. And I was like, well, why are they putting more people into the alarm list? Because the alarm list is your reserve force. There has to be a dire emergency, like the British are marching through your town in order for the alarm list to come out. And what I am finding is many of the communities, not Andover, but Haverhill and Salisbury, started purchasing coastal guns from Newburyport, Salem, Watertown, and other communities, mounting them on carriages, and then handing them over to the alarm lists to operate artillery. So the Minutemen strike first, the militia comes second, the alarm list, the reserve, is bringing up heavy cannon, in theory, if a battle was taking place. We are going to get into independent companies in just a second, because those kind of threw a curveball for us. Now, here's the Massachusetts order from the Provincial Congress, where they said it's time to prepare for war. They basically said, towns, you need to take a look at your arms and equipment. Make sure, if we go to war with England, make sure your muskets are working, make sure you have ammunition, make sure you have gunpowder. Okay, so the instruction that came out in October of 1774 was to make sure that every town was properly armed and equipped. Well, a great story that comes out of Amesbury, and just to prepare you, we're going to be picking on Amesbury a lot tonight. Okay, when we're not picking on the South Parish of Andover, we're going to pick on Amesbury. Amesbury had what was called a town stock, which is an ammunition depot. Just about every town in the Merrimack Valley had their own ammunition depot. The town stock in Amesbury had not been opened for several years. So they said, let's crack it open. We should have a bunch of muskets, we should have a bunch of gunpowder. Of course, the gunpowder probably expired, and we should have a whole bunch of ammunition. Let's see what we got. Cracked it open, empty. Okay. A bunch of people had helped themselves to it over the years. So now Amesbury is going, what the heck are we going to do? So they have to start trying to figure out, we have to start getting gunpowder somehow, we have to start purchasing lead to get ready, and we have to take a look, how are we going to provide weapons for our poor people in our community who do not own a weapon? And this is some of the mindset of the town during this time. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. And again, the other order which came during this time came in December of 1775. So basically in October of 1775, they said, listen, you need to start preparing for war. You need to start getting arms and ammunition. You need to inspect everything. Well, by December of 1775, John Hancock, as president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, is sending dispatches to the Merrimack Valley saying, not only do you have to do everything that we've told you so far, but you need to make sure your men in the field are properly armed and equipped. And we are going to define to you what they need to have in the field. If they're militia, Minutemen, or alarm lists, you need to figure out what they have. And what it comes down to is, first of all, you have to have an effective firearm. So this order from December of 1775 indicates what you need to carry in the field. It says, first of all, you need a good working musket. Number two, you need a bayonet. Bayonets are in great shortage in Massachusetts right now. Okay? Bayonets were not a priority up until 1757. Prior to that, Massachusetts colonial government said to their militia, you don't need a bayonet. If you got a hatchet or a sword, you're fine, or nothing, even better. Now they're rushing, saying, we need to get bayonets. They also indicated that you have to have a pouch. It's basically what's called a cartridge box, which is basically a bag that you would hold your ammunition rounds in there. You have to carry a knapsack, and you also have 30 cartridges. Cartridges is your ammunition, which basically means it's a paper tube with gunpowder, a lead ball or buckshot, or a combination of both at the bottom of the cartridge, which would be used to load the gun. The men were also supposed to have canteens, and they were also supposed to have blankets as well. Now, the other thing which you're going to get into, which I was really kind of excited about, because when you take a look at different books that are out there, particularly those you see in the 19th century, and I'm a big fan of Sarah Bailey's historical sketches of Andover, but I'm going to pick on Sarah in just a second for a couple of minor things that she said. But when you take a look at books from the 19th century, if you take a look at books from the early 20th century, there's this vision of the Minuteman who never drilled, just basically grabbed his gun from Andover and ran 30 miles to Lexington and Concord and engaged the British by himself. Okay? And Sarah Bailey does describe James Fry, who is the colonel of the Minute Battalion in the 4th Essex region. What happened was when they create that Minute Company, we're going to talk about it a little bit, after they formed their various Minute Companies, they voted for who's going to be our field staff. And Colonel James Fry from Andover, North Andover, was elected colonel. Go North Andover. But one of the things that I also found was the Massachusetts Provincial Congress said, not only should you have arms and equipment, not only do you need to prepare for war, you guys need to drill as well. You need to start preparing for combat. You can't simply just run out into the field willy-nilly. So what happens is, and I keep going, there we go. Okay. So what happens is, there was a big debate. What drill do we use? Military manuals have been in existence since the dawn of time. The drill that was used by Massachusetts up until 1774 was a drill called the Norfolk drill. The Norfolk drill came from England in 1757, written by George Wyndham. It was a drill that was designed for militia. It's lengthy, it's wordy, but when you take away and look at the actual military instructions, it's a very simplified militia drill. It's a good drill. There were some discussions that maybe we would do this. And then you got a guy from Salem, Timothy Pickering, who is always, I go back and forth with Timothy Pickering. Timothy Pickering is a little mercenary. He's always looking to make a buck. So in October, early November of 1774, he shows up at the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and says, hey guys, I'm hearing rumors that, you want us to adopt a drill. I'm selling a drill. Who wants to buy it? And his was basically called an easy plan of discipline for militia. He plagiarized the Norfolk drill on the first half. The back half of the drill is absolutely brilliant because it talks about hit and run tactics. It talks about if you're going to engage the British, hit them, withdraw, move to another location, hit them again. And he starts publishing anonymously in Essex County newspapers, including newspapers out of Newburyport, which are making their way down here into the Merrimack Valley, where he is advocating for this hit and run tactics. And then at the end he says, and by the way, buy my book. Okay. However, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress said, no, we are not going to use the Norfolk drill. We are not going to use the Pickering instructions. Instead, what we are going to do is we are going to adopt the same exact drill that His Majesty's troops are using in Boston. So in October of 1774, 3 days after forming Minuteman battalions, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress orders all of the militias and all the minute companies and all the alarm lists start using the same drill as the British Army is using. And they do. Okay? It's going to get so much better in a little bit, trust me. But what you start seeing in the fall of 1774 is you start seeing booksellers throughout the Merrimack Valley selling that drill in their bookshop. Newspapers are printing these up, selling them in their bookshops. And as a historian, Dr. Niels Hobbs, he actually did a study of advertisements, and you see a drop in the Norfolk drill being advertised, and you see a spike in the Crown Manual. And this is the British drill, the 1764 Crown Manual. Suddenly, everyone's gobbling up and starting to learn this drill. Now, where does the Merrimack Valley fall into what I've actually talked about? Well, first of all, the real interesting thing is, in September of 1774, the Merrimack Valley is spooked. Okay, they are spooked by the fact that they are going to war. So the first thing is, it appears that Methuen and Haverhill are the first two towns in northern Essex County to take steps to prepare for war. Approximately 20 days before Massachusetts Provincial Congress starts calling for the formation of Minuteman companies and prepare for war, Methuen is already removing its loyalist militia officers from its ranks. So Methuen is being very proactive in this case. Now, Haverhill is kind of this wild thing, okay? Haverhill is actually a very wealthy community at this time. They are considered a seaport community. The Merrimack River is deep enough down to Haverhill that they're building ships, and they're actually having a trade, mostly with Newburyport, but they're also taking imports into their town. The wealthy residents of that community formed what is called an independent company. So keep in mind, we have Minutemen, militiamen, alarm lists. Now I'm going to talk to you briefly about independent companies. If you follow the American Civil War, particularly in 1861, a lot of Union regiments were raised by or formed from paramilitary militia organizations that were usually made up of the social elite. Independent companies existed during the American Revolution as well. And I thought at first they only existed down in New York or maybe down in Philadelphia. No, there were militia independent companies in the Merrimack Valley as well as Newburyport. Independent company typically was made up of your wealthy elite, your influential. They would usually pay for their own arms and equipment. They would pay for, if they had uniforms, they would pay for their uniforms. And in the case of Haverhill, Haverhill decided to form its own independent company. And what it was is they formed 6 weeks prior to Massachusetts Provincial Congress. So now we're talking the beginning of September. They form an independent company that will be an artillery company. Again, they're taking these extraordinary steps. The only other independent companies I've been able to identify in the Merrimack Valley during this time is in Newburyport. Newburyport had 3 independent companies. It's crazy. Newburyport had 4 militia companies, 2 Minuteman companies, and 3 independent companies. 8 to 9 companies total. It's crazy. And of the 3 independent companies, one of them was a uniformed artillery crew. They had full uniforms. I don't know what the uniforms looked like, but they had uniforms. So this is what is going on for your initial response. And here is the order that basically dictates the creation of this artillery unit. They basically say on September 5th, 1774, we the subscribers, this is the members of this independent company, sensible of the importance of a well-regulated military discipline, do hereby covenant and engage to form ourselves into an artillery company at Haverhill, that they'll meet together for the exercise of arms and evolutions. Anyone neglecting due attendance shall be subject to a fine of 8 pence, and that each member shall be equipped with arms, accoutrements, and dress. Now what happens is they say, hey, let's form an artillery company. They look around and they say, okay, who's got a cannon? And they can't seem to find a cannon. But hold on to that thought. Now, following the instructions of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress of October of 1774, let's shift to the other towns in the area. You start seeing various militia units from Andover, Bradford, Boxford, Haverhill that are not part of that independent company. Amesbury and Salisbury, they all voted to vote out Richard Sotenstall, as I had mentioned earlier. Andover's South Parish, so it's Andover, Samuel Johnson is voted as his replacement. Recognizing how ill-prepared his regiment is, he issues what's called a circular letter. He writes a letter, goes to, has multiple copies made, and starts sending it to all his towns under his authority. And basically, what it says is, military preparations are the only measures we're in where we may expect to meet our enemy with safety and success. I earnestly call upon all officers in my regiment to exert themselves in their several places to cultivate a martial spirit and disposition and to maintain sincerity and activity therein by frequently mustering according to the Legislative Assembly has required. Interesting, he uses the term Legislative Assembly because he's referencing that rebel government, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. But here we have Johnson saying, okay, guys, we need to get together. You need to basically start preparing for war. I want to hear that you guys are mustering and drilling frequently. Oh, there we go. What happens next is the towns start debating, do we want to form Minuteman companies or we just want to keep with our militia companies? Haverhill, Salisbury, and Bradford move first, and by January of 1775, those three towns have voted for Minuteman companies. Johnson says, okay, what's going on in Andover? What's going on in Methuen? What's going on in Boxford? And what's going on in Amesbury? What he starts doing is he starts traveling to the different communities to talk to them and say, we need to see you guys forming Minuteman companies. Let's go. We're preparing for war. I want to make sure the 4th Essex is prepared. We have a Minute Battalion that's ready to mobilize if war is to start. His first place stopping, he comes here at his hometown in Andover. So on February 2nd, 1775, he does 2 separate meetings. He addresses the 4 militia companies from Andover. In the morning, he deals with the South Parish. In the afternoon, he comes here to North Andover. And basically what he does is he actively encourages them and persuades them, you need to form minute companies. He calls for volunteers. Men start rushing forward saying, we're in, let's do it. He goes to North Andover, same thing. And here is the Essex Gazette from Salem. The Essex Gazette, by the way, I purposely picked the North Andover colors, at least for a pause when we were kicking butt. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what happens is they're talking about how they form a minute company. There's so much excitement in the North Parish, it makes the news, okay? What happens is the companies, they elect Samuel Johnson, and they say how they go to the men who are heads of family and men of substance and probity. And here in the North Parish, they elect Captain Thomas Poor. So your Minuteman company here in North Andover is under the command of Thomas Poor. I want to say it's Benjamin. Yep, Benjamin Ames is the South Parish. Okay? So now Andover has gone from 4 military units to 6 military units. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, 2 units in the North Parish, I need 50 volunteers, preferably 25 from each militia company. Who's in? Now, your average militia companies at this time generally ranged from 75 to 140 in company size, so they can afford drawing some men away. And Andover successfully did. Now, Johnson's on a roll. So what happens is he then goes to Boxford at the end of February, and he does the same exact thing. And this is a copy of the newspaper that appeared in the Essex Gazette on February 2nd of 1775. And again, he visited them, met with the 2 militia companies. Of course, militia companies had multiple names for themselves. Foot companies, training bands, or Captain Alex Cain's Boxford Company. Okay, they had all these different informal and formal names. So when they reference in this newspaper article that they were going for the 2 foot companies, they're referring to the Boxford companies. Boxford had 2 companies of militia. Same thing, he is very successful, and as a result, 50 men step forward, and now Boxford has a Minuteman company. Then there was Amesbury. Now, Samuel Johnson went to Methuen, he hit Haverhill. For some reason, he never went to Amesbury. Amesbury is one of the few towns not visited. Now here's the wild thing. Amesbury decides to have a town meeting in March of 1775 while Johnson is going around the different locations. And they have the town meeting and say, all right, are we going to form a minute company? And Amesbury's response was that. Amesbury voted not to form a Minuteman company. Their rationale was it was too expensive. Okay? Now, show of hands, who's been to a town meeting here in North Andover? Awesome. I've been to my town meetings when I lived in Amesbury. I've been to my town meetings when I live in Merrimack. When you don't get something you want at a town meeting, what do? You call for another town meeting, get all your friends, and pack the meeting. And that's what Amesbury did. Okay? Amesbury was a little embarrassed, but they got together and they said, listen, we are going to form. And they had basically similar to Boxford. Amesbury had a East Parish, which was Amesbury, a West Parish, which is Merrimack. And as a result, they formed a Minuteman company drawn from the two units. Interesting enough, the person who was elected was Captain Matthias Hoyt, who resided probably about 3 blocks from where I live in Merrimack. So his grave is near my house. So Amesbury was the last of the militia companies. Now, we've got all this wonderful thing in theory in place. We have drill, arms and equipment, get your ammunition together. How did they really do it, though? Because if you think about it, many people will say, oh, they had leftover stuff from the French and Indian War. They just used that. Or listen, each of them had a rifle hanging over their fireplace. That's all they needed to run into war. They're all set. But really, what really happened in this time? And so what happened was I did some deep dives. I've been doing it now for probably about 5 years, and I've managed throughout Massachusetts Bay Colony to collect almost 200 accounts. About a quarter of them are from the Merrimack Valley, of towns that actually worked together, either neighboring towns, or they worked within their own community to ensure their men were properly armed and equipped. And what you actually see is each town, there's this wartime cottage industry where you actually have residents from the town making specific items for their minute and militiamen. So for example, cartridge boxes and belting. You would hire a saddler or a leather worker to start making these items for your militia and Minutemen. We have accounts of individuals, you're going to see in a second, taking old rusty bayonets and scouring them and then sharpening them up. You may have an individual who is making knapsacks for their militiamen. You could have another individual saying, I am going to go to Newburyport, I'm going to go to Salem, I'm going to go into Boston, I'm going to buy as much lead as I can, I'm going to bring it back up to Andover, and I'm going to start, producing ammunition for war. Or, my favorite is when you have woodworkers in your town, and every town had a woodworker, or even a cooper, okay, or a wheelwright. They would go to a militiaman and say, you have a fowling gun, okay? The gun is stocked with wood up to the muzzle. We can't slip a bayonet over it. The blacksmith is making bayonets right now, but we can't fit it on your gun because you have a stock that is up to the end of the barrel and we can't slide it over. So the town woodworkers started cutting back the stock to expose the barrel so you could slide a bayonet on it. A perfect example of modification similar to that is part of the Northern Historical Society's display of the musket. You can see that the stock has been cut back. Now, I think it's been cut back gradually over time to be consistent with 19th century hunting gun styles. Because Bob Allegretto and I were talking earlier, we do believe that the gun was converted to percussion at some point, which means they removed the flintlock and put in percussion. But it's an example of cutting back a fowling piece to expose a barrel so a bayonet could be slipped over. This is stuff that's going on in Andover during this time, these people. So you see this cottage industry where people are actually doing this. So what happens is, they're not fully uniformed, but there are certain aspects of each town's minute and militia companies where they look similar. Same cartridge boxes, same belting. Maybe the same guy made the knapsacks, and you have this sense of uniformity. And so here's some examples of what Merrimack Valley towns were doing during this time. First of all, Methuen and Andover, their big priority was bayonets. They wanted to get bayonets into the hands of their minute and militiamen. Now, Captain John Davis is the commander of the Methuen Minutemen during this time. Methuen resolves in the early winter of 1775, January, that they're going to provide bayonets which should be brought to Captain Davis when the service is over. So after the war is over, we'll return them to the selectmen and redistribute it back to the people who loaned it. So they are asking every man within town, if you have a bayonet in your property, we need to give them to our minute company. Drop it off at Captain Davis's house so we can distribute it to his men. This one is my personal favorite. This is Bradford. This is an account I found in the bottom of a basement of a church off a beaten path somewhere over near Whittier Tech. Okay? This is a selectman order from 1776 reimbursing 3 guys for the work they did in the build-up to war in late winter 1775. So we're talking January, February, early March. First of all, you have Phineas Carleton. Phineas Carleton was responsible for 2 things. First of all, Bradford basically said, anybody who has an old bayonet from the French and Indian War or any of the previous French wars, drop it off with the selectmen. They were given to Mr. Carleton. He's scouring the rust off of them, and then he's sharpening the guns, the blades. Mr. Carleton was also a leather worker, so he was also making belting and scabbards for these bayonets. You also have a William Greenough, who was making cartridge boxes for the Bradford men. And then you have a Phineas Cole, who's also, Phineas Cole is leathering cartridge boxes. Mr. Greenough is fitting the bayonets onto the guns. So he's making any adjustments to the bayonets to make sure they slip onto the barrels, okay? Because sometimes if a person is issued a bayonet, it may not match up with their gun. So he's doing blacksmithing work to try and adjust the width of the socket. And then finally, Andover. Andover votes that any enlisted soldiers with bayonets are to turn them in. And what is going to happen is they're then going to redistribute them to the minute companies first. And if they don't have enough bayonets, Andover is going to go out and buy them. And what I do see is in different towns, they're sort of bartering with each other, saying, hey, do you have any extra bayonets? Okay, oh, you're looking for some extra cartridge boxes? Fine, we'll switch. Okay, so I do see some of this going on in the Merrimack Valley as well. And the neat thing is, I got this from the Andover Historical Society. Sorry, North, I cheated on you guys, sorry. Contained in here is that bayonet order. Okay, so this is an actual copy of the bayonet order. Now, let's get back to Boxford and Amesbury. Boxford, first of all, Amesbury's in a financial situation here. They are really, really tight on money. So as a result, they say, listen, Minutemen, militiamen, you're on your own. Okay, you got to provide your own arms and equipment. Okay, so what I would expect to see for an Amesbury militiaman, if they fielded on April 19th, which they did, they probably would not have cartridge boxes. They would probably have what's called a shot pouch, which is like a small leather bag with a powder horn. Most of them probably didn't have bayonets. They were probably carrying swords and hatchets. They probably had, knapsacks and blankets. But basically, Amesbury says, you're on your own. Boxford basically says the same thing. You're on your own. But they say, listen, if you're going to equip yourself, you should be equipped the same way the old Massachusetts militia laws existed prior to this crisis. Because militia laws existed all the way back to 1640. And in the laws, they actually said, this is what you carry in a time of emergency. So Boxford kind of kicked it back to the old militia laws and said, hey, show up with a gun, show up with some sort of ammunition pouch, show up with a powder horn, show up with a knapsack, canteen, etc. Okay, remember that fancy Haverhill artillery company, all the rich merchants who were getting together and saying, we're going to form an artillery company? Well, first of all, they couldn't get a gun. They could not find a cannon. So they said, hey, if we can't be an artillery company, what's also cool? We're going to be Minutemen. So they decide, hey, we're going to form a minute company. So they just basically convert themselves and they become, basically Captain James Brickett's minute company. And they get together and say, listen, if we're going to be cool, we've got to do this in style. Because we got to represent the Merrimack Valley. And we're not going to leave it to these Andover people, these Amesbury people. We're at Haverhill. We're going to make sure we look awesome. So they literally spent a meeting in March debating what they should wear. And this is what they came up with. They said, we're going to look awesome. And they would have. They basically say, on March 21st, they say, voted that we dress in a uniform consistent of a blue coat turned up with buff and yellow plain buttons. The coat halfway up the thigh with pockets of slope, which means we think they're called vertical pockets. Nankeen waistcoats, kind of fancy, and breeches, and all white stockings with half boots or gaiters. Also that the hats be cocked alike, and that each person have a bright gun, bayonet, and steel ramrod, and that they need to get into that uniform by the first Monday of May. And that each man will also get supplied with 1 pound of powder, 20 balls, and that you got to show up and make sure you look nice. Wow. They would have looked awesome on the field. Don Troiani, who's a historical artist, did a conceptual drawing of what they would have looked like, and that's probably what they would have looked like. If you ever see buff and blue, usually Massachusetts, I mean, during the French Indian War, Massachusetts soldiers who fought with the British during the French Indian War wore blue and red. The buff and blue, there were some influences with independent companies throughout Massachusetts that had that color, so I see where they're coming from. It's also cheaper, in theory, to acquire, but they never got the fabric, and obviously Lexington and Concord happened before the May deadline, so I have no evidence that this was ever came into fruition. But it's pretty sexy. Okay. Now, here's where we have the fun stuff. Did they drill? Okay, everyone's telling them, drill, 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 drill. Did they actually do it? And the answer is a resounding heck yes. Andover basically said on the first day of December, they ordered their town's minute and militia companies to get together and choose a person to teach them the drill. Keep this in mind. We're going to come back to that in just a second. And what this person would do is leading to instruct them to be most skillful in military discipline, and that while they're at the drill, they have to be equipped with good guns and other necessary warlike armor, cartridge boxes, bayonets, etc., so that they can perform all military maneuvers. Amesbury, despite the fact that they have no money, says, hey, we want you exercising 4 hours in a fortnight, which is roughly, I think, about 20 days. However, 2 weeks later, they reverse themselves and basically say, you guys need to be drilling 4 hours in a week. So now they're drilling weekly. Methuen, basically, all they said was, listen, draw out and exercise. Now we're starting to get a little closer here on this, who are we going to have for drilling? Haverhill initially voted that their Minutemen would be disciplined in squads. So they're taking their companies and breaking them down into 4 or 5 different sections, and each of those sections is going to be drilling independently of each other. On March 14th, they said, listen, Haverhill said, we are going to pay $30. We're going to raise $30, and we're going to hire a military instructor. This is the second town to say that. Okay, what's going on here? Well, on top of that, 1 week later, the town's Minutemen, Brickett's company, that independent company, came back together and said, listen, we're going to hire this guy named George Marsden. Okay, George Marsden's going to train us. And so what I start seeing is when I'm looking at the Merrimack Valley, every town in the Merrimack Valley from Amesbury all the way down to Andover, I'm either seeing George Marsden or I'm seeing where we've hired an instructor. Okay? Now when I heard the name George Marsden, I said, who the heck is this guy? And I had visions in my mind of a old French Indian War grizzled veteran who's like standing on the common shouting at the young boys, how to fix a bayonet and so forth. And I did this during one presentation where an expert, Don Hagest, who's an expert on the British Army during the 18th century, at the end of my talk corrected me and said, you aren't even close. He said, George Marsden was a British deserter. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. Because we keep seeing here, references, that the Independent Corps is going to hire George Marsden. So who the heck is George Marsden? He's a British deserter. George Marsden was a grenadier from the 59th Regiment of Foot. He deserted from Boston on July 24th, 1774, according to his regimental muster rolls. Afterwards, he worked his way up to Haverhill, Massachusetts. Now, why would he go to Haverhill, Massachusetts? Two reasons. One, Haverhill is on the New Hampshire border, or close to the border, but no, it's on the border. And two, Haverhill is notorious for being a haven for British deserters. And I'm going to show you a newspaper clipping in just a second. So as Massachusetts was preparing for war, George Marsden began to sell his services. And what he did was he was hired by Andover, Bradford, Methuen, and Haverhill. I can't find Amesbury, although there's hints of him possibly being in Amesbury, to train and drill their minute companies. I have just discovered 2 weeks ago, while he was training the Merrimack Valley, he was also going up to York County in Maine and drilling them as well. Now, ultimately, he settles in Maine before he moves to New York at the end of the war. He becomes part of what's called Scammond's Regiment, which is a Maine province regiment serving during the siege of Boston. But here he is in here. Now, this reenactor is actually wearing the uniform of the 59th Regiment of Foot. 59th Regiment of Foot is notorious for their god-awful, ugly facings of purple. This is what a 59th soldier would have looked like. So in short, the Merrimack Valley, which nowhere else in Massachusetts can actually claim, was being trained by a British deserter. Soldiers that came out of this town were trained by George Marsden for war. And that is going to be important when I give you my footnote on Bunker Hill at the end. Well, moving forward, this is why is an account that came up. It's a Newburyport newspaper account from 1773, where deserters, James Darnley and Thomas Sherwood, both of the 14th Regiment of Foot, were apprehended up in New Hampshire for desertion. The British sent a party of officers and men up into New Hampshire because they got tipped off where they were and arrested them. They're bringing them back down through Haverhill. Haverhill mobilizes a militia company as well as a mob shows up as well. They overpower the British officers and overpower the soldiers, free the two men, and help them escape. And they were basically ushered back up into New Hampshire and never seen again. I've seen several accounts of this going on in Haverhill. So Haverhill is a problem for the British Army. It's a safe haven for British deserters, which is why George Marsden ended up in this particular area. Now, the other really neat thing I found was not only was George Marsden drilling the companies on the company level, the Merrimack Valley minute companies and militia companies were getting together for battalion or regimental full drills. And so what happens is you're actually seeing Methuen, Bradford, Haverhill, Andover all getting together on a field day. Hundreds of men on a field drilling together in preparation for war while the British deserter is watching and training them. And so what I see is on April 13th, 6 days before the battles of Lexington and Concord, here in this town, there was a battalion-level drill. And I found out because it's in Captain James Sawyer's records from Haverhill. And he talks about how they have a joint drill with Captain Thomas Poor and his men. He then goes on to talk about how there's other companies from other towns present as well. So they're all mental level of drilling. Now, of course, the great thing is if you're going to work to preserve your neighborhood and if you're going to go to war, you got to get paid, okay? And so most of the towns in the Merrimack Valley did vote to, hey, if the men are drilling and if they're mobilized for war, we are going to compensate them. The neat thing about some of these accounts, Amesbury basically says you'll have 1 shilling for exercise 4 hours in a fortnight, and that the commanding officer of said Minutemen shall keep an account to make sure they're paid. 1 shilling. Not bad. Bradford voted each man $1 for billeting, and if they are mobilized for war, $7 a month. Now, the really neat thing about some of these accounts, you're seeing the old English currency, and now you're seeing, New World / Spanish dollars coming in here. Andover did pay their men. There was no Prop 2.5 override. Sorry, I had to throw that out there. 8 pence for each half day they exercised, and it was seasonal because you're pulling these men away from the farms, away from their livelihood. So during the summer months, 1 shilling, and if they're called into active service, 36 shillings. Whew, that's a pretty good pay. And Methuen basically said, we're going to pay you 8 pence for every day dedicated to drilling. Not the greatest, but they're getting paid. Now, before we get into Lexington and Concord, I just want to stop real quickly and talk about the Salem Affair. The Salem Affair is where the British Army launched a military operation against Salem because they had received reports that there was artillery being stored in Salem. The British were very nervous about American forces in Massachusetts getting their hands on cannon, particularly brass cannon. There were 4 brass cannons that were stolen out of Boston. The 4 cannons were rumored to be in Salem. General Gage wanted them back. Brass cannons are very durable on the field. They're very light, maneuverable, and pretty accurate for 18th century standards. He wanted them back, so he dispatched the 64th Regiment of Foot to march on Salem. There was a confrontation that took place in Salem. As that is happening, alarm riders start going out into Essex County, alerting them that the British Army has moved against Salem. The Merrimack Valley men mobilized, and it's kind of really unique how they mobilized. Andover and Methuen basically mobilized as if you're heading out towards Peabody. I know 114 didn't exist then, but that's the general direction they went. Everything north of the Merrimack River swung wide up through Newburyport and down towards Ipswich to try and get to Salem. So you have this almost like pincer move that's going on. I think it's because of the closest roads they were at. By the time when most of the Haverhill and Salisbury and Amesbury men were in Ipswich, the affair was over. Basically, there was a negotiation where the British were allowed to inspect the area where the cannons were there. They didn't find anything. They went back home. Andover probably got about as far as Middleton, maybe a little bit further than that, and they started to turn around. But there's a really neat story that comes out of this I love sharing. It's a funny story. Because there was a Newburyport newspaper account that basically said the Newburyport militia companies, once they hit Ipswich and were told everything was over, they turned around and stopped in either Raleigh or Newbury at the first tavern they hit and drank it dry, and then stiffed the tavern owner and kept marching on. And I was like, how dare Newburyport do that? That's why the rest of the Merrimack Valley hates Newburyport. How dare you embarrass us? Well, I have to apologize to Newburyport, because I have received a second newspaper account that was shared with me by the National Park Service, and they said, listen, there was somewhat like of an editorial correction. It wasn't Newburyport, it was Amesbury. And Amesbury really embarrassed themselves because not only did they drink the tavern dry, they trashed the tavern. They may or may not have beaten up the tavern owner, and on the march home they just started vomiting, okay? Amesbury. There was multiple newspaper accounts, horrified at what Amesbury did, embarrassed. Even the regimental Colonel Fry and Colonel Johnson reprimanded the town. What were you guys doing? Well, jumping forward, on the eve, 2 days before Lexington and Concord, on April 17th, 1775, there is a massive fire in downtown Haverhill. So if you are familiar with where, I think it's Water Street intersects with 125, I think it is, right there, that's where the center of Haverhill was. And this is where a lot of their industry is, this is where a lot of their wharves are, this is where a lot of their taverns and meeting houses are. Destroyed all the buildings. Multiple people are homeless. On April 19th, which I'm about to get into, but I do want to talk about this with Haverhill. On April 19th, Haverhill could have sat it out. They absolutely could have sat it out and said, listen, we have this. Okay, we have this massive fire that tore through our town. We can't mobilize. We're economically devastated. The men of Haverhill they assembled in the shadows of what was their town and said, we're going to war, and they marched off, okay? So that's, again, some of the courage that you're seeing here in the Merrimack Valley. Well, let's talk about the battles of Lexington and Concord. I'm going to assume everyone knows about the battles of Lexington and Concord, so I'm not going to take a deep dive into that because we'd be here till tomorrow if I was talking about Lexington and Concord. But something happened in Lexington and Concord, we can all agree. Well, what happens is Andover is the first town to receive word of that there has been, the British are marching towards Concord. And around the same time, they received word about 7 in the morning, okay, on April 19th. Probably within the next hour or two, they probably received a follow-up rider that the Battle of Lexington had occurred. So now they know we are at war. By 10 o'clock, the North and South parishes had mobilized. Ames's company is ahead of Poor's company, just because of their geographic location. The route of march took them basically out along what would be now Dascombe Road into Tewksbury. From Tewksbury, they went into Billerica, and then Billerica into Bedford, which we'll take a deep dive in a second. First of all, we have an account from Lieutenant Benjamin Farnham, who is a officer of a minute company in Andover. Now, the 2 minute companies mobilized, the 4 militia companies from the town mobilized as well. Methuen and Bradford mobilized sometime afterwards. By about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, the word had reached Amesbury in Salisbury, and they started mobilizing as well. So you see this gradual, staggered approach. The ways of mobilizing or alerting, you have your traditional Paul Revere type riders. Timothy Herrick from Tewksbury is the rider who came into Andover to notify the alarm. You also have what are called signal guns, which are usually a pre-appointed 1, 2, or 3 guns would fire in succession as an alert that you need to mobilize your militia. I've heard references, I haven't been able to document it though, of beacon fires, something similar to if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings with the beacons have been lit. Supposedly there may have been beacon fires, but I haven't been able to verify that yet. But Benjamin Ames talks about how the Minutemen of Colonel Fry's regiment were alarmed, and that news of troops marching from Boston to Concord. They marched very quick from Andover and marched within 5 miles of Concord, then receiving the news of their retreat for Boston again, at which point they shifted their course to catch them. We retreated that day to Menotomy, which is modern-day Arlington, but we could not come up with them. With the night coming, we stopped, and the next day they marched into Cambridge. This is very important, because the recent research has come out where you have your Middlesex County minute and militia companies engaging the British Army. And what they are doing is they are selectively picking their ambush spots. This is not this, every man for himself. You have militia and Minuteman companies, they will come into the battle. They will then go from their company and break down into squads and sections and break off. Attack at the ambush point, reform the company, swing wide, and then hit the column further down. That's what's happening in Middlesex County. But at the same time, you have companies like Andover that are trying to get to the battlefield. And they're on the second consecutive ring of this battle, and they're constantly having to shift their direction, okay, to try and intercept the British. And that's what happened with Benjamin Ames's company. They're heading towards Concord. They're deep inside Bedford, and suddenly say, listen, they're retreating back to Concord. They have to swing back to where they came and start swinging through Lexington, hopefully to intercept them. You have a similar account. I just realized that was you. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Allegretto, sexy man. For the record, the hair's real, okay? That's why I'm jealous of him. You have a second account of Thomas Boynton of Andover. This particular is his account. This, I believe, is in the Massachusetts Historical Society, this particular letter. And it's a lengthy letter, but he says, again, he's of the South Parish. And he says, listen, just at sunrise, we're getting word that the British are advancing on Concord. He talks about how they mobilize at 10 o'clock. When they reached Billerica, in Tewksbury, they received news of the Battle of Lexington. When they hit Billerica, news comes that there was a fighting in Concord, and as a result, he also goes into how they have to shift direction left and right. And he says, after we came into Concord Road, he describes how he sees houses burning and others plundered and dead of the enemy lying by ways, others taken prisoner. So they're coming into the aftermath. They are in the post-war scene where they're seeing homes destroyed, homes plundered, dead on the road, British prisoners. Okay, so they're on the peripheral edge of the combat at this particular point. This particular, Ames has got close, okay, but they didn't make it. And then we have our hero, James Stevens of the North Parish. And this is, I don't think Tyler is here tonight. I think he's at a meeting down in Lexington, but any of the graphic designs you see for the 250th, I believe he is the person who is responsible for it. First of all, as a side note, my sainted Irish Catholic mother, who was an English teacher, I've shown her the James Stevens. She says she just wants to correct him for the grammar writing because it's just absolutely awful. Just desperately wants to give him a grammar line. But he describes, we went through Bedford, we went into Lexington, we went to the meeting house, and come into the distraction of the regulars that killed 8 of our men, and he sees a cannonball had gone through their meeting house. Lexington's meeting house is located on the green. Okay? In the 18th century, a meeting house is also a church. Okay? So now you have the British Army firing artillery pieces through Congregationalist meeting houses, okay? Which is considered highly, highly offensive. As they're advancing through East Lexington, which is some of the heaviest, ugliest fighting of the day, it's borderline hand-to-hand. He's seeing he's seeing every house, houses on fire. Some houses are plundered. He sees livestock that's killed in the road. He sees homes plundered. He sees furniture lying out in the middle of the road from the plundering. And this is going to be offensive to the men because, again, not only are they seeing the church blown away, in the 18th century, plundering is considered a capital crime equal with murder. Okay, people in the 18th century are executed for robbery and plundering. This is like they're watching probably the most offensive thing in their mind. They're seeing dead, destruction, again on the front lines here are coming along. And so one of the questions that comes up, and Bob Allegretto and I talk about this all the time, why didn't, if they're on the peripheral and they're talking about running really hard to try and catch up to the column, and they're right along the edge, they're at the back end in the aftermath of the fighting, perhaps maybe they could have caught up. Why didn't the Andover companies, the 2 Minuteman companies, reach the column in time? They stopped for lunch. According to James Stevens, when they marched through Tewksbury, when they got into Billerica, they stopped at Pollard's Tavern and had a snack of biscuit and cheese. They probably were there for about an hour. Had they not, now they got to eat, I get that, it's not the best meal to have. Biscuits and cheese is gross, but they had that. I am of the opinion, had they not stopped for lunch, they probably would have intercepted the column in Lexington or probably would have ended up in Menotomy. It's a double-edged sword, okay? On the one hand, if Andover was in the Menotomy fight, they could have ended up like Danvers. Danvers was slaughtered that day. Menotomy was, the modern equivalent of Menotomy is Black Hawk Down. Menotomy is an ugly, ugly section of April 19th where it is literally house to house, room to room, hand to hand, okay? At the Jason Russell house, 21 American men were killed in the space of probably about 20 minutes. Okay, this is how brutal that fight is. So it may have been a blessing in disguise that Andover lucked out that they stopped for lunch because there was probably a good chance they probably would have popped out ahead of the column and they probably would have gone down to Menotomy where a lot of the Essex County units that made it to the fight were congregating and forming. Now, I had mentioned Amesbury earlier, that Amesbury received word about 11 o'clock to mobilize. Normally, I talk about the alarm system, firing a gun, beating of a drum, signal guns. Amesbury decided to write out their orders. Isaac Merrill, who was a town selectman, took it upon himself to sit down and write out the order to his militia and minute companies for Amesbury to mobilize, wrote copies of it, and then had people dispatch it to it. Kind of defeats the purpose because they had a late start. But what I can tell you, this is in the custody of the New York Public Library. It is only one of 2 written orders from April 19, 1775 that is in existence today. The other one is from the town of Watertown, okay, which is in the Museum of our National Heritage down in Lexington. But the neat thing is this comes from the Merrimack Valley. Now Amesbury, where did the other towns go for their route of march? They followed Andover. They pretty much went down through Andover, into Tewksbury, down to Billerica, and then swung through Bedford down into Lexington that way. I don't have any evidence of them swinging through Newburyport and coming down. And of course, when these militiamen are trying to cross the river, they're clogging the ferries, okay, all up and down. There's multiple accounts of them clogging up the ferries. And of course, here's a transcription, which I'll be sure to share with the Northampton Historical Society, because I always share my presentations so you can help yourselves. But boy, did he write out a lot. Now, if you go to Sarah Bailey's historical sketches of Andover, particularly if you're interested, hey, was my ancestor in one of these companies? She doesn't transcribe all of the, what's called the alarm rolls. So every company that mobilized, with the exception of Lexington, Concord, and a couple of others. If they mobilized that day on April 19th, eventually they sent a bill to the state of Massachusetts to be compensated for mobilizing. And what they did was they created these muster rolls. Every town of every man that mobilized, how many miles they marched, how much they spent on food, how much they spent on drink, etc. As a side note, I should also mention, as another fun story, Newburyport. When Newburyport mobilized on April 19th, first of all, they refused to believe it happened. When the first alarm riders arrived about 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they said, this can't be true. This has got to be fake news. We're going to send a rider down to Danvers to confirm. The rider came back about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and Newburyport mobilized at that point. When they mobilized, they had a supply wagon with them, which included fish, cheese, bread, chocolate, and 65 gallons of rum. Because if you're going to go on a road trip, Newburyport's going to outdo Amesbury. But getting back to this, every town had a muster roll. Well, what Sarah Bailey did in her historical sketches of Andover, about 3 or 4 of them are included in there. So if you're looking for ancestors, you might be able to find something in here. I would encourage you to go down to the Massachusetts State Archives, which is located down in Dorchester. They have all of Andover's muster rolls, so you can see. So you see the various towns that we have here. We have muster roll from Andover. That would have been Captain Peter Poor, not the Minuteman Company, his relative. You have here, true roll by men of my command. Abbott's Company, which is a militia company. You have Lovejoy's Company, again, another militia company. I believe this one was out of the North Parish. Then you have, it continues down here as well. You see this is another militia company that belongs to Joshua Holt. So, as my final thing before I finish is, I wanted to finish this because the Merrimack Valley gave so much during the American Revolution. And you know, again, with the 250th of Lexington and Concord coming up in 3 weeks, everyone's going to be focused on Lexington. Everyone's going to be focused on Concord. And it's like, well, what about Andover? What about Methuen? What about Bradford? What did they do, you know, that is something that we should remember? Again, they've given everything they could for the Lexington alarm. They gave so much more in this. Okay, when you take a look at the regiments that were inside the redoubt. So the redoubt is where most of the casualties are going to be for the battle that day. Okay, most of the American casualties. The 3 regiments that are inside the redoubt, the first one is Colonel William Prescott's regiment. Prescott's regiment is composed of both southern New Hampshire men as well as Merrimack Valley men from the Middlesex County area of Westford and Dunstable. You then have Ebenezer Bridges' regiment, which is also inside the redoubt. It's composed of Merrimack Valley men, including Bill Ricka, Chelmsford, Tewksbury, and 1 company from Andover. And then finally, Colonel James Fry's regiment, the Minutemen, that were raised earlier in the year. Andover, all the way up to Amesbury, are inside that redoubt. Now, this was a nasty, nasty battle. The British suffered almost 50% casualty rates for that day. Okay, it was nasty for the Americans as well. The key thing is this. Massachusetts in 1775 was deforested. There are accounts of Andover residents going to Holt Hill over by Merrimack College and watching the battle from there. I have accounts from loyalists sitting in Boston who were talking about how all the hillsides all around the battlefield for as far as they could see are filled with people watching the battle. I don't have an account for Wire Hill if they're looking from Wire Hill and watching, but here's the other thing. Trees muffle sounds. The artillery that the British are bombarding, the American position could be heard as far north as Exeter, New Hampshire, which means the people here in Andover could hear it. The burning of Charlestown could be seen from Andover, okay? So think about what the home front is experiencing at this particular time. And then when you look at the casualties for the Merrimack Valley, the British total casualties had over 1,000 men, of which 226 and 828 were wounded. By comparison, American casualties were 441 men, of which 140 were killed, 271 were wounded, and 30 were captured. Most of them were from the redoubt during the 3rd wave of attack, when the British, now the Americans run out of ammunition, and it's now a hand-to-hand fight as the Americans are trying to escape. Now, of the casualties, breaking down those 3 Merrimack Valley regiments, Prescott's regiment had the highest casualty rate, with 42 were killed, 28 were wounded. Bridges' regiment, which had a company of Andover in it, had 15 were killed, 29 were wounded. Fry's regiment, 15 were killed, 31 were wounded. For Andover, 5 were killed, 11 were wounded. Okay? This is Andover's Lexington. Okay? So my homework assignment for all of you is start spreading that word, okay, to make sure that those who sacrifice from this town, both North Andover and Andover, are recognized. Okay? 5 killed, 11 wounded. By comparison, Lexington, 10 killed, 10 wounded. Total casualties for Lexington, 20. Total casualties at the Battle of Bunker Hill for Andover, 16. Pretty close. 35% of casualties in Fry's regiment were from Andover. Okay? This is why, again, Bunker Hill is the Merrimack Valley's fight, because of these 3 regiments that are in there are Merrimack Valley. And Fry's pretty much had, but if he was definitely in the top 3 to 4 of the regiments that were decimated that day. So with that, thank you very much. Any questions? Okay.
Testing 1, 2.
Yeah. And let me.
It's just so the people watching online can also
Oh, okay.
Yes.
On the mobilization, how did they do the communications? I heard you say there was a runner, who go, but from that point on, and also, how did they travel? Was it all by foot?
It was all by foot. Usually what would happen is as you have your Andover moving in towards the engagement, you still have alarm riders and people reporting what is going on. Most of these towns, the towns that are along the battlefield, mobilize their alarm lists as well, that last resort militia, because the fighting's going right through the town. Other communities that are passing through, Billerica, Bedford, things like that, probably most likely the alarm lists are also saying, listen, you need to go this way. This is the latest we've heard for fighting. A rider came through. So it's a communication of literally word of mouth or mounted word of mouth. Moving from places, it was on foot, but it also depended upon your militia company. Many militia companies or minute companies purchased wagons to follow them, sort of like a supply wagon. They'd throw their packs, throw anything they didn't want to carry into battle into the wagon, and off they would go. Many of them, however, just simply carried everything on their back, and they marched from point A to point B. The only time they probably would have got, I mean, they did rest, they did stop for lunch and dinner. They probably would get a break if you're crossing the Merrimack River on that ferry, but the rest of the time they're on foot.
And what about medical help? Did anybody follow along?
There was surgical support once the siege began. For wounded, what was happening is, let's assume Bob is wounded in Lincoln during the fighting there. They are going to pick him up and bring him to the local doctor in Lincoln for treatment. So they're relying upon local doctors and local physicians for treatment during this time. No, okay. Yes, sir.
You indicated that there were 5 people killed from the Andovers.
Yes.
Do you have the names of those?
Give me a second, I do. Okay. I came prepared this time. They were Samuel Bailey Jr., Philip Abbott, William Haggett, Joseph Chandler, and Jesse Holt. They appear to have been from Captain Ames's company, and the other one was from Captain Furbush's company, which is part of Bridges' regiment. Ames's company and Poor company kind of combined when they got to the siege of Boston. So you have elements of both North Andover and Andover within this regiment. But I will make sure I share it so that you have the names as well.
So those guys were mostly from West Andover?
I'm sorry?
Those guys were mostly from the west half
Yes.
of Andover? Philip Abbott was black.
That, shame on me, I did not know. So you have a patriot of color who is also a killer. So,
Had, I think, 20 black guys
yeah,
from the town
yeah.
at Somerville.
Yeah, so it was an ugly, ugly, ugly fight. Particularly, most of the casualties were sustained once the British got over that redoubt wall. I thought there was another question. Yes, ma'am.
We have
Oh, sorry, yes, sir.
Yeah, that's okay. You talked about supplying the Minute and militiamen with arms. Did a lot of those people come with their own muskets?
The majority did. Majority did. And the weapons that you see, I'll break it down. Most of them were what we call fowling pieces, which are 18th century hunting guns or shotguns. For military weapons, I've seen what is called a committee of safety musket, which is a knockoff of a British weapon. I've seen the desired weapon of choice is the pattern 1728 French infantry musket. Easy to break down, easy to maintain in the field. Back up to that is a fusil de chasse, which is a French hunting gun. For British arms that were in American hands on April 19th is the pattern 1730 gun. I very, very rarely do you see like second model Besses, which is what the British Army was carrying on that day, or first model pattern 1758 or anything like that. It was usually the much earlier French 1730 that were handed out during the French wars.
Did they also make their own musket balls
Yes,
individually?
they did. They did. They were usually what they're doing is they're buying lead, they're melting it down. Keep in mind the difficult thing is most of the guns in the militia, different calibers. So the person would have to, the militiamen would have to meet with we'll call him the armorer, the person who's producing the bullets. They have to do a bore calibration to measure it, then they would make the bullets based upon the caliber of the gun. And I've seen in one town, unrelated to the Merrimack Valley, on April 19th, the Minute Company shows up at the town stock, that ammunition depot, and there's a clerk writing down, okay, I gave this guy this number of pieces of musket balls, and this is the caliber of his ball. So it was really kind of wild to see something like that. Yes?
I'm going all the way back to the beginning of your slides, but all of this stuff that was going on after the British had shut down the city of Boston, didn't the British get wind of what was going on under their nose and try? So all of this must have been going on very quietly.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that because I get that question a lot, and I purposely leave it out hoping somebody would ask. General Gage was well aware, because everywhere from Andover to Lexington to Worcester to Plymouth, and everywhere in between, they're doing this out in the open, okay? Gage basically has a spy network. They're mostly loyalists who are writing back, reporting. Like Saltonstall was probably before he fled, was reporting what is starting to build up. And he's writing back to England saying, this is getting out of control. They're arming up to the teeth, they're drilling openly, they're talking, they've got a rebel government, I need more troops to squash this. So he was openly, but he was pretty much powerless, because anytime they would march out, then British troops would exercise in the countryside. They'd go out for a march just to, let's say, stretch their legs. Anytime they went out in the winter of 1775 or the early spring of 1775, there'd be a militia company suddenly appear on the hill watching them, see if this is just an exercise or doing something else. So Gage was also trying not to exacerbate the situation. So as a result, he was well aware of it, but he was basically, he was powerless to do anything, and they're doing everything underneath his nose. So, oh. Yes?
Yeah, what was going on in other areas of the colonies?
During this time?
Yeah.
So, they're pretty much similar thing. We'll take Lexington, for example. Lexington was in full wartime preparation. They are drilling almost every day. They're making arms and equipment. You got individuals who are cutting back the musket stocks. You have the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which is running the business of the colony in defiance. They're issuing orders left and right. And they're actually actively taking steps to create that Massachusetts Grand Army. They said, listen, we've got all our militia system in place, but what do we do once war breaks out? They create rules of war and create organizations, so when the war happens, they're establishing new supply depots. There's one in Worcester. The real neat thing is they have a canteen supply depot. It's just canteens down in Brookline, which is literally underneath the British nose. And you have some communities like Newburyport and Amesbury that are starting to talk about maybe we should be getting privateers and start sending them out into the ocean when war starts. So you see this same wartime buildup in other communities. There's very few communities that are resistant to this movement. In fact, the only community I could outright call out and say they were resisting this movement was Marshfield. Marshfield was actually a loyalist stronghold. They wrote to Gage and said, listen, the poo is hitting the fan. We need some British troops down here to protect us because our neighboring communities like Scituate is eyeing us to possibly come in and attack us. And so what happened is Gage sent a detachment of troops down there. So you see most of the 98%, 99% of the colony is lockstep in with this movement. One or two communities are kind of resistant. The other thing I will actually say is if you are a loyalist, you're being chased out of town. Okay, or you're keeping your mouth shut, one of the two. So.
That's actually, that's similar to what I was going to ask, because I expanded my knowledge, understanding of the Revolutionary War by the book series Outlander.
Mhm.
And if you've read the book or watched the show, that takes place starts in North Carolina, and I was struck when I thought about, you have neighbors, and you walk through town, and this is where I think it's different. You don't know if that person's a loyalist, that person's a, what do we call them now, patriot, the winners write the history. But I was going to ask, did that take place within our towns? But it sounds like if you were a loyalist, you kept your mouth shut.
Yeah, usually there's a book that was written probably about half a decade ago called The Disaffected, which looked at that analogy, hey, a third of the population in the United States was patriot, a third was loyalist, and a third was disinterested. The Disaffected, it predominantly studied the Pennsylvania colony as well as New Jersey, and it talked about how the disaffected did their best to keep their mouth shut because whoever the ruling power was in their neighborhood at the time, if it was misinterpreted that because they are keeping their mouth shut, they're on the other side, they could be subject to retribution. For the loyalists of Essex County, here's the weird thing what I've seen. A lot of loyalists, when they fled, they were either subject to what's called expulsion and seizure, which means they could never return, and they lost all their property. However, a lot of loyalists, maybe the not so prominent ones, were allowed to return after the war, and some did. The crazy thing is in the early 19th century, a lot of Essex County loyalists formed a society where basically it was a social club that met in Salem that showed, again, kind of flaunting, hey, we survived it, we're loyalists, and they were quietly told, you don't want to do this right now. The war may be over, War of 1812 is over. Now this is like about 1816, 1817, so it's the older generation and their families. But some loyalists in Essex County were allowed to return afterwards. If they didn't have their property seized, then they were allowed to return, but they were carefully watched up through the end of the Revolution.
Yeah, I was wondering, particularly in Outlander, they talked about tar and feathering and businesses being burned and a lot of back and forth among the neighbors, citizens.
The analogy I'm going to give, or not the analogy, but the point is I'll shift it to the west with New York. Okay, when you start looking in the Albany area, what you see happening in the Albany area is probably more on line with almost like French Revolution type stuff. They're seizing property, they're breaking into houses, there's accounts I have of loyalist women who are being paraded through towns being pelted with poo and rotted food. Families are chased up into Canada. Families are held hostage in order to try and force the male loyalists to surface and surrender themselves. And then vice versa, you have accounts of loyalists like, okay, we are going to crush this mob, we're going to crush this unruly order and punish them as best we can. And that's the thing where the problem with a lot of history within the 19th century is it came out in the aftermath of the American Civil War. Okay, and as we all know, American Civil War was horrible. Whenever they would write history, it was more to try and create a patriotic feeling, to try and unify the nation, but the tone of revolutionary violence was severely, severely downplayed. I have an account of a Minutemen woman for a presentation I'm doing later this week, where she is literally holding her kids all together as the fight in Minutemen is taking place outside her house, and she says no less than 70 bullets went through the house. They're striking the chair that I'm hiding behind, in her account. This is the level of violence that's taking place. And it's one that unfortunately in the 19th century, because it was watered down for those reasons, and we're so far removed also from the revolution, that it doesn't have the impact that it did back then. This was a life-altering moment on April 19th. Whether they engaged or not, it changed everyone's lives at that time. So, any question? Yes?
I have a question. So apparently there were over 300 men that marched to Lexington on April the 19th. How many people lived in Andover at that time?
I'm doing the math in my head. You're probably looking, with about 300 militiamen moving in Andover, you're probably looking at about, Newburyport, which was a wealthy community, had about 2,500. I mean, you're probably looking at minimum, probably about 2,000 to about 3,000, and it spread out throughout all of Andover. Because Andover was a much, much larger community than, say, Bradford or Boxford. So you're looking at that, and that includes women, children, enslaved people, things along those lines. That would be my estimate, based upon what I've seen for populations for the area. So, other questions? Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, what became of the militias? What became of the militias, the companies that marched to Cambridge?
Awesome question. Okay. Nothing. No, I'm only kidding. This is what happened. When you can think of it in waves. Okay, so you have your first wave. Everyone who mobilized in response to April 19th ends up outside of Boston. Generally, the militias stayed out there for between 5 to 8 days. Okay, now they're thinking, I got to go back to my farm. I got people I got to take care of. So you start seeing the militias starting to peel away and the minute companies staying. Okay, however, by May, that's not a feasible process, and so the provincial Congress says, listen, the militia system is not working. We have to raise actual regiments, okay, of different companies to sustain the siege. Some of the minute battalions, like Fry's from here in the Andover, because they stayed, they would just simply reorganize into a part of the Massachusetts Grand Army as Fry's Battalion. Other areas like Lexington, all the way out towards Concord, where they were wiped out and their militia companies were back in town, you had recruiting officers come up where they were actually raising brand new regiments. And so you have a mix of the old response units from Lexington and Concord, as well as these new units that are fighting side by side. And there was a lot of politicking going on during this time. There's accounts I have. Fry pretty much kept his regiment intact, but there's other Essex County regiments. They're fighting with each other. You have Littles and Gerrishes, which is out of the Newburyport area. They have a split. The regiment, it was originally Gerrish's regiment. They split off because the officers hated Gerrish. They formed Little's regiment, so you see that happening. You have basically a half moon around Boston, okay? Most of your Essex County regiments are concentrated between Cambridge and Chelsea, okay? Middlesex is generally central from about Cambridge. Some are up in Chelsea, but most are in Cambridge, heading towards Roxbury. Your southern county regiments are along Roxbury, working their way over to Dorchester Heights. The Army was under the command of Artemus Ward, who was the overall commander. William Heath and Joseph Warren were his sub-commanders, until Washington came in and completely reorganized the Army at that point. And then you see the birth of the Continental Army, where he starts basically merging regiments together or restructuring regiments. But it was a scramble from April to Bunker Hill. Yeah. It is a big, big scramble. A lot of these regiments that actually entered into, Fry's was not one of them, but we'll take Gerrish's for an example. They were not at full strength when they entered to try and cover the American retreat during the battle. So it's a mess.
You indicated that they gathered in Andover to muster in Andover. Do you have any idea where that was in Andover?
Given that it was Thomas Poor, I would probably put, I know the common out here is not the original common. So wherever the original common, which I believe is near your house, I believe it would have been in that area. They would have mustered on a common. Yeah. Or, okay, so it would have been over that way. Or, as I have seen in other regimental battalion levels, if a town resident had excessive farmland, they may have opened it up to that area as well. But usually there's a purpose for a town common. You know, it's usually where they would be having their military operations. And commons were big back then. We're talking the minimum between 3 and 5 acres in size. So there's enough room for some maneuverability. And it depends on what the men are doing. Usually, now here's the funny thing, which I'll finish with this story. Usually when you have a militia muster and a battalion muster, what do you do after you finish? Go to the drink. You have a nice meal. I've had multiple newspaper accounts of a nice meal. Then you have some drinks. So probably that's what happened. There was probably a big party here afterwards. But I would expect they probably would have gone to that, wherever the original common was, this way. That's where they would have mustered. And it's a good central location, keep in mind, because you got units from other towns coming.
I'm going to repeat Norma's second question. We hear that Becky's Pond, which is the triangle behind Rocky's Ace Hardware on 125,
Interesting.
was a mustering ground. We
Okay.
also know that opposite Bob's house at Kittredge Farm, there was another mustering ground
Yep.
because that was near the old town meeting house. But
That,
where-
that,
what was Becky's Pond?
I've seen towns with multiple commons where they've actually would have like squads drill, and then it would be like a primary common that they all assemble for a company muster. Where you're describing is actually in line with my thinking of how the North Parish was built out, because when I drive on 133/125, or if I go along the back way of the common, and I see those houses that are off, near the common, where they kind of set back and they are period houses, I'm like, that kind of looks like there might have been a common within the vicinity. There's also, keep in mind, there's an account of what's called the Ipswich Fright, which I never talked about tonight, where 3 days after Lexington conquered, there's a rumor that hits this area that the British have landed in Ipswich in revenge for Lexington conquered, or marching through the area killing people. And by the time it hit Andover, the rumor was they landed at Plum Island and were coming down the Merrimack Valley. It was a rumor, it never happened. But the one single 19th century account that I have of the Ipswich Fright for Andover says the North Parish women and children and old men who were in this area fled to Den Rock, which again kind of puts that within the vicinity of a town common. And they fled to Den Rock supposedly to hide. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you've got a second common. Keep in mind also you had 2 militia companies in town. So again, sub-commons that are being used for that purpose. So, but I'm not sure if the Rockies Ace was there either. So,
Probably not, but a good place
Yes.
to go for your
The
backpack.
ye
and
old handsaw.
extra
So,
ammunition. Thank you.
all right. No more? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you
you.
again for coming tonight, everybody. If you liked this program, please keep an eye on the rest of our programs throughout April. We will be having more lectures here, as well as the April 19th tour, which I'm happy to say our tour bus now filled. But if you do come here on April the 19th, you might be able to get into a steeple tour over at the North Parish Church, and we will also have the Parson Barnard House open for that day, which will be open to go and visit. So thank you once again for coming, and another round of applause for Mr. Cain, please.
Thank you.